On one of my videos that went viral back in early 2016 about the project to house refugees in the northwest of Romania, some comments dwelled on the idea of an Eastern European Union. Since then, quite a few backers of this channel have asked whether this would indeed be possible. In higher circles than my tiny YouTube channel, this discussion went from non-existent in 2005, or 1991 for that matter, to a serious topic to ponder upon over the course of the last 3 years. Most of you watching this probably wouldn't know it because the English language media remembers Eastern Europe even exists only to bash us when we don't want to destroy our societies via massive uncontrolled immigration from North Africa and the Middle East, or when we dare to vote the wrong way in referenda concerning the pet projects of the minuscule privileged globalist elite. But what if this idea isn't new? What if this idea is one whose time has come? What if Intermarium is not just possible, but needed? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Alright, so this is an immense topic that I cannot hope to do justice in under 1 hour, but that's exactly what I will try to do, and also leave quite a bit of interesting of reading and watching material in the low bar for those who want to go even deeper into the topic. So, for the purposes of this video, we'll split this into several segments. Segment 1, brief history. Segment 2, the reappearance of Intermarium on the agenda in the last 10 years. And here we'll talk about various possible scenarios discussed particularly in Poland. Segment 3, Intermarium today and possible scenarios for the future. Segment 4, what went wrong in the past that could go right this time. And finally, segment 5, personal opinions and conclusions. Alright, so with that said, let's dive in. So, segment 1, brief history. As we usually say on this channel, all political ideas are old, it's just that the packaging that is sometimes new, but even that is usually old. This definitely holds true for the concept of Intermarium, which in its form, understood by most people today, is roughly 100 years old. But in a wider sense, the concept of Intermarium is almost 200 years old. But first things first, let's get the name out of the way. Intermarium is a compound, or better said, a contraction between the two Latin words inter, meaning in between or between, and marium, meaning seas, being the genitive plural of mare from Latin. So it's basically the territory between the seas. Now this Latin name became the norm even though the concept is of mostly Polish origin, and the reason is quite simple. The Polish name Międzymorze is simply difficult to remember and to pronounce for most people not Polish. Now, Międzymorze, though, means the same thing, the intersea or between seas. Alright, but which seas? And, well, here comes the complicated part. If you look up the term on the internet or ask a university professor or whatnot, most of the time you will be told that the concept originates with the Polish World War I leader Józef Piłsudski, whose strategy was to create an updated version of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, all of that is indeed true, and we'll get to Piłsudski in a few minutes, but that is not the whole story. Now, As you may know, for a long part of the second millennium, Central and Eastern Europe has been dominated by basically three forces: the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the latter is basically the longest-lasting one. Very briefly said, some form of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, under various names and constructions, existed between 1385 Anno Domini and until 1795, so over 400 years. Now, the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a field of study in and of itself, so we won't dwell too much on that. But the point for this discussion is that ever since 1795, when the Commonwealth effectively ceased to exist following the third partition of Poland, ever since then discussions over some form of what was later to be known as Intermarium did occur, and the rationale was pretty much the same as in late 1300s. The Polish-Lithuanian Union and the subsequent military alliance had come about as a mutual response to a common threat posed by the Teutonic Order. The fact that it lasted over 400 years showed that it can be done, and one of the reasons it failed was believed to be the fact that the alliance wasn't strengthened. For instance, during the existence of the Commonwealth, there were talks about expanding it to a Polish-Lithuanian-Ruthenian alliance to defend the area from both the Western threat and the threat of the Ottomans at that time. In any event, throughout the 19th century, talks about rebuilding the Commonwealth in an expanded form were quite present. The most notable figure would be Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, who, whilst living in Paris and acting as the uncrowned king of a now non-existent Poland, wrote one of the earliest books on Eastern European geopolitics called Essay on Diplomacy. Now, in this book, he argued that the recent actions of Russia make Russia a threat to Europe, particularly the central and eastern part of Europe. The Polish-American historian Marian Kamil Dziwanowski notes that Prince Czartoryski aspired to get enough support to build a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth federated with the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Romanians, and all the South Slavs of what was to become later on Yugoslavia. Poland, in his mind, could have mediated the conflicts between Hungary and the Slavs and between Hungary and Romania. And with the nationalist uprisings and revolutions all over Europe happening in 1848, the idea sounded somewhat achievable. Well, it sounded until it didn't. But more on that on the fourth segment. In any event, the prince died at age 91 in France, but his ideas lingered on and were later picked up, at least in part, by the much more known figure to modern people, Józef Piłsudski. Now, there is enough material out there on Piłsudski, so I won't go into all the details, but I will mention two crucial differences between Piłsudski and basically all other previous ideas. For starters, Józef Piłsudski was convinced that there can be no independent Poland without an independent Ukraine, and this is a direct quote, thus recognizing that the conglomerate of the heirs of the Hetmans, the Cossacks, and other peoples that we commonly know today as Ukrainians are not just different people than Russians, but people with a common civilizational and military interest with Poland and not with Russia. Now, here I must point out that Russian aggression is not something the Bolsheviks invented. It predated the Bolsheviks by at the very least 200 years, and as we can see today, it survives alive and well in the post-Bolshevik era as well. Now, the second thing that Piłsudski understood, unlike his predecessors, is that the Intermarium would better be focused first, second, and last on defense, and a lot less, if at all, on other issues. Thus recognizing that the nations of Central and Eastern Europe have to first and foremost survive before even considering any other issues. This came not from a very long work of scholarship by Józef Piłsudski, but from his instincts and the pragmatism that he acquired as a wartime leader. This understanding, however, came a bit too late for Piłsudski, namely after the Polish-Soviet War, which, even though secured Polish independence, it did create a tremendous amount of bad blood between the Poles and the Ukrainians. Some scholars go as far as to say that the failure of Piłsudski to create at least a Polish-Ukrainian alliance is one of the big causes of both of the nations losing their independence 20 years later after World War II. In any event, after the Polish-Soviet War ended in 1920, Piłsudski contemplated a much wider federation, drawing upon previous lessons. His next idea was a Central European Union, which would include Poland, the Czechoslovak Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, but also some rather surprising members, namely Italy, Finland, Sweden, and Greece. And things could have happened, at least in part, in this fashion. In 1920, Piłsudski invites Romania officially to various forms of a future Intermarium strategy, and while the initial very bold offer is refused by the Romanian Prime Minister at the time, Alexandru Averescu, the two countries do sign a defensive alliance 1 year later in Bucharest, an alliance that was to last until 1939. Now, the first treaty was explicitly about countering the Soviet Bolshevik threat, as both Polish and the Romanian intellectuals, diplomats and statesmen recognized that a cordon sanitaire with Poland in the north and Romania in the south was absolutely needed, considering that Hungary was going through some Bolshevik turmoil and Marxist-Leninist uprisings were also occurring in Germany. The idea of an Intermarium, even though it wasn't officially called that way, did catch in both countries, and soon after, Romania's foreign minister, Chodakiewicz, created what is now known in history as the Little Entente with Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Now understand that at the time, Romania shared borders with both Poland and Czechoslovakia over what is now known as the Transcarpathia region in Ukraine. Now I actually showed images from that area on this channel. The legacy is still visible today in many respects, both the Czech, the Romanian, and the Polish legacy. Anyway, what is less known is that the Little Entente was supposed to include Poland and Greece as well. But again, Poland's disagreements with Czechoslovakia over borders and Greece's disagreement with Yugoslavia over Macedonia pretty much stalled that project. Again, the failure of that likely contributed quite a lot to all of our countries falling behind the Iron Curtain just 25 years after Chodakiewicz move. But more on that again in the fourth segment. Now, the Romanian government tried again in 1934 with the Balkan Pact that included Yugoslavia, Greece, and Kemal Atatürk's secular Turkey. But then a diplomatic scandal created by a book signed by the Czechoslovak ambassador to Bucharest pissed off the Poles and thus prevented any advancement of Piłsudski's idea to create a mutual aid support network with either Poland or Romania, or perhaps both, as bridges for mediating the rest of the conflicts. Yeah. Welcome to Eastern Europe. Alright. Now, this was as brief as I could get. For even more information, please see the description box where I will leave several very long videos plus some more reading material. There's a reason 2 world wars started here. This region, which I shall refer to as Intermarium from now on, this region is complicated and its history is very complicated. Anyway, let us go to segment 2, the reappearance of Intermarium on the agenda. Now, I won't pretend to know which came first, but it is quite obvious that since the commencement of the latest Russian aggression against Ukraine, the talks about an Intermarium have reappeared, whether they're calling it Intermarium or not. Some would say that the Visegrad Group, or the V4, is another attempt at an Intermarium, considering that Romania was also invited, but the post-communist government in 1991 refused. I would respectfully, though, disagree with that view, because the V4 is not a military defensive alliance, and it's not exactly a cultural one either, although officially it is. The V4 was established to work to move all of its members into the EU and cooperate with each other to influence the European Union. That is as far away from the Intermarium spirit as it can possibly get. Now, with that said, it is obvious that in the last 5 years that has slowly started to change, as the Visegrad Group now not only stepped up its military cooperation with the creation of the Battle Group, which basically is now composed by what could be the core of Intermarium, namely V4 plus Romania and Ukraine. But anyway, more on that in the next segment. What is to be mentioned, what is to be remembered, is that things have slightly changed within the V4 in the last 5 years. What needs to be kept in mind, regardless of my opinion though, is that the Intermarium, in all of its previous and most current and likely future conceptions, was and is supposed to help its members counteract both the Russian aggression and the Western aggression, and that would be, of course, the German threat. So, as I was saying, in the last several years, talks about the Intermarium have definitely intensified. Even before the Ukrainian crisis, Romania and Poland signed a strategic partnership in 2009, and unlike the previous Polish-Romanian alliance back in the 1920s, it actually did progress into something much faster. Also, the alliance was already subjected to a political test, the test being Ukraine. Both Romania and Poland have their historical reasons to spit venom and manifest animosity towards Ukraine, yet the statesmen and most of the people of both countries did not take the Russian bait and instead stood by Ukraine, something which Piłsudski could have only hoped to achieve almost 100 years ago. The Ukrainian crisis, combined with the sudden drop of oil prices, did in fact bring the Intermarium agenda much closer, arguably closer than it has ever been. Przemysław Żurawski-Vergajewski of the Department of International Studies of Politology at the Łódź University was writing in April 2015 that, quote, following the confrontation against reality, whatever the Germans were imagining that contemporary Russia may be, the direction to which it is heading towards and the extent to which the alleged civilizing influence of the European Union and Germany is going, all of that turned out to be a mixture of naivete and wishful thinking. Continuing with, quote, as a result, we must build a bloc that would stretch from Scandinavia to Romania and be friendly with the Anglo-Saxons. The so-called main current of the EU's policy has reached its zenith. It won't get any better than that, unquote. This would be the boldest call for a Józef Piłsudski style of Intermarium that I am aware of being uttered during this century. This move was followed by the comment of what is hoped to be an annual event called the Intermarium Conference. The first edition was held in Kyiv in 2016, and if my information is correct, they'll have it again in June this year, this time in Warsaw, Poland. Meanwhile, some academics have picked up on the idea as well, so in July this year there's another Intermarium conference scheduled in Warsaw, and I will leave a link to that event in the description in case some of you might want to go. Now, the 2016 Intermarium conference proposed that the Intermarium can be composed, presumably in a best-case scenario, by Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, Czechia, Slovakia, the Baltic States, Moldova, and, a bit surprising, or perhaps not, Belarus and Bulgaria. In any event, I will leave both a sympathetic and a critical article about the conference in Kyiv, so you can read a bit more about that, should you be curious. Some other optimistic scenarios that I've seen included Georgia, that would be the Republic of Georgia, not the United States, not the US state, that is. But one has to wonder, how would an Intermarium defend Georgia without the support of Armenia and especially Azerbaijan? And good luck getting Armenia and Azerbaijan to work together, considering that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is still underway as we speak. Conversely, I've also seen some more, let's call them conservative scenarios, which did not include Hungary, Romania, and Czechia, although such a scenario is the least likely to happen for the simple reason that the modern understanding of Intermarium is not supposed to be revolutionary, but rather to work within existing frameworks, and thus such a scenario would impose an undue burden on Poland alone. Anyway, let's move forward. Segment 3, Intermarium today. Now, as I was hinting in previous segments, a form of Intermarium, even though not officially called that, is in many ways well underway. Now, we can argue on whether it started with the 2009 Romanian-Polish strategic partnership or with the creation of the V4 battle group, but what is harder to argue against is that the core nucleus of an Intermarium is slowly catching where it matters. And by that I mean in military terms amongst nationalist and conservative statesmen and among bourgeois intellectuals of aristocratic descent. Whether that descent is intellectual or culture or genetic is of little importance, at least in this area, in the Intermarium. Now, while you won't hear on TV anytime soon about Intermarium or things like Visegrad Plus, these things are slowly happening. On military terms, the cooperation between the V4, Ukraine, Romania, and the Baltics has probably never been better. On terms of influencing EU policy, there is an obvious block that rarely changes. For instance, when refugee quotas were debated, Poland dissented because it was led by a cucked government, the civic platform of Donald Tusk, who now, just like any other failed politician, has a cushy job at the European Union. On energy policy, for instance, the V4 plus Romania and Bulgaria form a consistent group that blocks EU policy based on the fictions of the religious left and the green communists. And I could go on like this with examples for another 20 minutes. In one way or the other, a core Intermarium can be said to exist already, whether it calls itself Intermarium or not. Now, at this moment, the Intermarium pretty much works like most of Europe. Some countries are in for some things, but out for other things. For instance, Norway is not in the European Union, but it is in the Schengen Agreement. The United Kingdom was in the European Union, well, it technically still is, at least till 2009, but never in the Schengen Agreement. The same goes for the Intermarium at this moment. Bulgaria, for instance, is in when it comes to combating leftist policy on energy, but not in when it comes to strengthen military cooperation with Poland and Ukraine. Croatia is in with everyone else in the Intermarium when it comes to securing borders, but not so much when it comes to energy policies. This situation isn't likely to change in the near future, but over the long run it will, because the biggest challenge for the countries of the Intermarium will be the religion of pieces, whether we like it or not. This includes Russia. By 2030, the Russian army will be majority Muslim. Sooner or later, the Muslim threat will supersede the Russian threat. Sure, there will be Muslims who speak Russian, but the kind of threat will be different. The Russia kleptocracy has one kind of aggression in mind. A Russian-speaking Muslim army will have a very different kind of aggression in mind. Same goes for the West. Germany isn't likely to be a threat for the Intermarium anytime soon. Not as Germany, but as a Muslim-dominated place? You betcha! And of course, constant throughout the history of Intermarium will still remain the southern Muslim threat. With Erdogan's neo-Ottomanist view, it would be a mistake not to expect to hear more from Turkey. George Friedman of Stratford was noting a bit over a month ago after a tour of the Intermarium that, quote, "Regardless of my view, I got the sense, particularly in Hungary and in Romania during past trips, that they see a significant increase in Turkish power which they perceive as a threat to the region. This leads to the idea of a Three Seas alliance. This initiative would expand the Intermarium concept by focusing on Turkey in addition to Russia. In some scenarios, the alliance would be extended westward to include the Czech Republic and even Austria. More importantly, this alliance would stretch southward into the Balkans. The immediate motivation seems to be to create a force that could block the movement of Syrian refugees through the Balkans and into the rest of Europe, but the concept goes somewhat further. It seems Turkey is acquiring a desire to spread its power in several directions, south into the Arab world, west into the Mediterranean, and northwest into the Balkans. This mirrors the Ottoman Empire, which did not extend into these regions by accident. When Turkey is a great power, geography causes it to expand this way. Another concern underlying this alliance is that Turkey might use its commercial relations with Balkan countries that have large Muslim populations, particularly Albania and Bosnia, to create a political base in the region. If this were to happen, the Turks would have many potential options. For Hungary, which spent a century under Turkish domination and has a sense of history where centuries are mere days, this is a real threat. But the Poles also seem to share in this threat. In the Three Seas strategy, Eastern European countries would shift from a passive stance waiting for Russian moves to an active one of trying to integrate the Balkans into their alliance. This would draw in the Russians, allies of the Serbs, just as the Turks pressed their incursions. Russians, Turks, and the region that roughly resembles the Habsburg Empire mixing it up in the Balkans is an old story with consistently bad endings. The entire discussion in the region is theoretical, and since the core Intermarium hasn't taken shape yet, with Hungary being particularly wary of it as an anti-Russian grouping, we can for the moment class this as a geopolitical speculation. The view I took before is the one I take now. Such a group will emerge, but we are still at least a decade from it, and for that matter for Turkey ready to become a regional power. It has to settle many things internally before then. However, there is a ferment in the region, and it is driven by the European Union's weakening and Russia's perceived decline. Eastern Europe countries have lost confidence that the Europeans will take risks on their behalf. Close quote. Now, George Friedman thinks that the core of Intermarium hasn't taken shape yet, because Orban appears to be wary of joining an overtly anti-Russian group. But this is because Friedman usually places an undue emphasis on rhetoric and theory and then looks at practice. I tend to do exactly the reverse. And when it comes to practice, Orban did not deviate at all from the Intermarium consensus to support Ukraine. In a way, it kinda does make sense why he gets along with Trump so well. Orban pretty much does the same thing. He says a lot of things on TV, some of them really stupid, but when push comes to shove, he goes with the right policy most of the time. This is particularly true in terms of foreign policy with Viktor Orban. He has said quite a lot of weird things and some things that were outright wrong, but when it came to actually doing things, he by and large did the right thing. Now, of course, that doesn't make Orban a saint, but this is exactly what could prove to be the strength of the Intermarium, namely that no one expects politicians to be perfect, because perfection doesn't exist, as all humans are flawed. Understand that in the Intermarium, the universities and the intellectuals haven't been put through the process of demoralization and subversion as it has happened in the former Western Bloc, including and especially North America. The Intermarium still does have enough of a pool of intellectuals that not only can smell subversion from far away, but can also effectively tackle it, whether it comes from Dugirist or Russian sources or from progressive leftist Bruxellian sources. And this aspect really does matter. Because if the Intermarium process will go forward, it will have to go forward slowly, just as George Friedman suggested, and it will have to be unabashedly conservative. And so far, this has been happening, and this is largely a good thing because it forces the leftists and other collectivists in the Intermarium to go nuts. For instance, when tighter collaboration between Hungary and Romania commenced on the issue of diversity, multiculturalism, and the religion of pieces, it left both the progressives and the fascists in the offside in both countries. The fascists hated because they pretty much live to hate one another. And the progressives hated it because the only way they could argue against it would have been to go the fascist way and say bad things about the neighbors. And that was a tough one for them. Well, the existence of such situations do win hearts and minds much faster than other strategies, precisely because most people aren't big fans of neither National Socialism nor International Socialism. And if you steal their toys, both the National Socialists and the Progressives are caught naked, which is great. Now, George Friedman gives a decade before we'll see an Intermarium, but it will depend on external factors quite a lot, in addition to the internal factors. Now, speaking of internal factors, let's go to segment 4, what went wrong in the past that could go right this time. So, as I was saying, in the history segment, there were a few unassailable disputes in the 1930s that now, in hindsight, we can argue that they contributed to the failure of the Intermarium project. Perhaps the two biggest disputes were the Polish-Czechoslovak conflict over the border and, of course, the Romanian-Hungarian conflict. The first one is all but extinct, with the disputed territories either now being in Ukraine or ossified quite well in either Poland or Slovakia, basically. The latter is also mostly extinct, although you wouldn't know that by watching TV, where both politicians and various political pundits try really hard to stoke ethnic tensions. With the Fidesz founder chanting "Long live Romania" at a Fidesz conference in Budapest, with the Romanian infantry defending Hungarian borders and the Hungarian Air Force defending the Romanian airspace, the idea that Romania and Hungary would go to war with each other anytime soon because 50,000 ethnic Hungarians in Romania and 20,000 ethnic Romanians in Hungary are upset, I'm sorry, but that idea strikes me as absurd. Sure, there will always be moaners on both sides, but the era of extreme rhetoric towards the neighbor on the mainstream political stage isn't likely to come back anytime soon. And no, the YouTube comment sections don't count, though I'm sure many keyboard warriors will be very quick to disagree. Also, the acceleration of the migrant crisis buried many hatchets amongst many. The idea of seeing, for instance, quote-unquote extremist pundits from Hungary and Romania working together to gain hearts and minds on the issue of Islam and the civilizational threat that it poses would have been unthinkable in 1992, but it's pretty much the norm today. And through tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of such processes, the Intermarium conscience will likely grow, because sooner or later more will reach the conclusion that Branislav Wildstein expressed in the interview that I translated back in April. The conclusion being that unlike Western Europe, we know we are mortal and that we can disappear if we don't focus on survival and defense first and foremost. One aspect that did go right in the 30s that may not go so well now is the Balkans question. Unlike the 1930s, there is no Yugoslav king with whom the Romanian and Polish leaders can cut a deal with, like it was the case back then. On top of that, there are three problematic countries. Those would be Serbia, Bosnia, and Macedonia. Serbia because of its apparent Russophilia. And I say apparent because once you dig a little bit below the surface, it's not the Russophilia that moves the Serbs. It's not what makes them tick, except maybe for some very old people who would be dead anyway by the time Intermarium gets serious in terms of becoming an official thing. But other than those people, no one in Serbia is seriously in love either with Russia in general or with Putin in particular. What does make them tick, though, is anti-Americanism, because Kosovo. And that is not an easy question to solve. Now, personally, I think Kosovo is Serbia, and that is the only issue in the last 30 years in which I disagreed and still do disagree with NATO. The West should have not taken the side of the Kosovars at all. But regardless of my opinion, solving the issue in Serbia for the purposes of Intermarium is not an easy thing, and that is, to put it mildly. This is why any Intermarium project cannot include Serbia anytime soon. Then there's Bosnia, which still has conflicts with Croatia, although they have gotten better in the last several years, but it has the problem of having half of the population bowing to Allah. And then there's Macedonia, which hasn't been able to get some political stability in the last several years. Recently, for instance, protesters got into the parliament and beat the crap out of the parliamentarians because they didn't like the election results for the prime ministers. Now, on top of that, there's also an older and still not resolved, or at least toned down conflict between Bulgaria and Macedonia. Not to mention the Greeks being pissed off that Macedonia exists. As I was saying, very, very long story and a complicated question to solve. So on this note, Croatia, Slovenia and Montenegro have the clearest path to being part of an Intermarium, or a 3C strategy, as George Friedman put it. While for the rest of the former Yugoslav kingdom, things are just much more complicated. Now, I'm not saying this cannot be solved. They sure can be solved. But I am saying that it is nowhere near that easy. Now, another thing that went wrong in the past that could go right this time is, well, time itself. Russia, if it won't start a war by 2019-2020, it won't start any war at all before 2035 or even later than that, because money. At the end of the day, war is expensive monetarily, and it also requires cohesiveness and good demographics. Russia ranks poorly on all three, and it will take 15 to 20 years to recover on all three of these aspects. Although on the cohesiveness front, things aren't looking great at all for Russia. Anyway, in the 1930s, the Intermarium project appears to have lacked the time to develop. If World War II had not started in 1939, it would have probably happened, or at least advanced much further than it actually did. Nowadays, time is a bit more on our side. The only threat now is an outbreak of a civil war in one of the former Western Bloc countries, be it France or Sweden, but even that one is a low threat compared to the imminent war threat that was already apparent since early 1930s. Now, that's not to say that war is completely unlikely to happen in the next 10 years. The future is, after all, an open question. But for all intents and purposes, the place is in much better shape now than it was in 1937. And finally, the last thing that went wrong in the past but could go right this time is the Scandinavian question. Presuming that the Intermarium would evolve the way Piłsudski envisioned it, or as the Polish politolog Przemysław Żurawski reiterated it back in 2015. If that direction is to be employed, the contexts that prevented the Upper North from joining the Intermarium project are much easier to tackle now than they were in early 1920s. Also, the incentives are quite different now. Sweden and Finland are not NATO members, so from a security standpoint, an Intermarium project could indeed be attractive. More to the point, one of the main reasons Finland refused the Intermarium in early 1920s was out of fear of losing its independence, which was still very young. Since then, however, the Winter War happened, the demilitarized zone happened, and many other shenanigans by Russia towards Finland have happened. So at least in theory, Intermarium would be a much easier sell in the 2020s than it was in the 1920s. Sweden had just gotten out of a union with Norway 16 years before, in 1905, and was in the process of reorganizing itself when Intermarium was pitched to Sweden. Also, the 1920s was a period of internal turmoil inside Sweden when radical changes were being experimented, and I guess that's in a way just like things are now. But still, since then, many things have happened that could, again, in theory, make the case for Intermarium much easier to sell in the 2020s than in the 1920s. And with that, let's go to the final segment, segment 5, personal opinions and conclusions. Alright, I guess the main thing that I need to say is, how do I see a future Intermarium? And of course, no matter what I say, I will disappoint some people. But in all seriousness, my view on the Intermarium is not that radical at all. If it wasn't apparent in this video so far, I think the Intermarium, if it is to work, has to start from the core countries that already do work in a form of Intermarium already, namely Poland, Romania, Ukraine, the Baltics, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia. Then, on top of these, Croatia and Belarus should absolutely be co-opted into the project. Notice that I don't mention Moldova, and that's because I think if Intermarium gets serious, Moldova will either become part of Romania or more likely be partitioned between Romania and Ukraine, or if that won't happen, it will simply do as it's told by its neighbors. Sorry, Moldovan Satalists, you don't actually matter. Now, for those curious to learn more about the minutiae of present-day Republic of Moldova, I made a video about that back in April 2016. Links, of course, in the low bar. Now, as I said already in this video, over the long run, the main threat will remain Islam, likely divided somewhat between Turkish Islam, Russian Islam, and Western Islam. The German army trains with rifles made out of wood, so the military threat from Germany against the Intermarium is quite low over the short run. Over the short run, the German threat consists of bad ideas, bad demographics, and crap geopolitics. And all three, of course, are at their all-time high these days. Over the long run, however, Germany will be more and more Islamic unless things radically change, which I'm not optimistic about at all. With Russia, basically the same thing. The Russian military is not capable enough now to pose a very serious threat, but it will be in 15 to 20 years from now, just in time as its military will be majority Muslim. As for Turkey's neo-Ottomanism, this period may last for just 10 years or so until Erdogan fades away, but it may also last for the next 100 years or even more. So I would rather prepare for the worst and hope for the best. This is a map of Islam in Europe. It is now apparent, I hope, why I regard the core of Intermarium to be basically V4 plus Ukraine, Romania, and the Baltics, and why Belarus and Croatia are immediate candidates as well. The proportion of Muslims in each country will matter, and the low number of Muslims will matter a lot more in the near future. And I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but then again, this is the personal opinion segment. Anyway, I believe that if the Islamist madness isn't seriously curbed in the former Western Bloc, we're gonna need Intermarium more than ever, because the Intermarium will essentially be Europe. At least for a while, until the next Reconquista can be made, or Islamism fades away via Reformation or some other means. Now, I realize this sounds extreme, but then again, it also sounded extreme when Western intellectuals talked about the looming Islamization danger in late 1980s and early 1990s, and everyone thought they've been smoking something wrong. So in this regard, I think the Intermarium would fundamentally be the same as it was imagined in the 1920s, namely to guard Central and Eastern Europe against both Western and Eastern aggression and act as a cordon sanitaire, but I think the aggression it will guard against will be more Islamic motivated than traditional Russian or German imperialism. But in any event, even if I'm wrong with the Islamic point, I still do think that overall having fewer Muslims should be a criterion to joining the Intermarium, because the Intermarium should also be a union of countries that have some degree of cultural similarities. And the countries colored in white on the map do have that degree. They've all been through Soviet occupation, they tend to know instinctively that socialism is garbage, they are majority Christian or conservative atheist in the case of Czechia, they are majority European, and they share a much more common cultural heritage than they're probably willing to admit at this point. Just Google the popular or folk costumes in all of these countries. To the untrained eye, noticing the differences between them takes quite a skill. Or, put it another way, the average countryman nearby Kiev has much more in common with the average countryman from northern Croatia than the average countryman near Szeged, Hungary, with the average countryman near Lisbon, Portugal. Speaking of conservative atheists, Gallup just published a poll this month about the opinions of Eastern Europeans when it comes to the so-called Syrian refugees. Now, Eastern European is used here in a geographical sense since it includes Greece. For starters, none of the countries polled have support in more than single digit for open borders. The most tolerant of the countries polled is Bosnia, where 8% of the public believes that Bosnia should receive all of the Syrian refugees. Slovakia and Bulgaria stand at 1% or less, Romania and Poland at 2%, and Hungary at 3%, although in Hungary as much as 70% of the public believes Hungary should receive exactly 0 refugees from the Islamic world. Breaking the numbers by religion, though, it turns out, completely unsurprising to me, that the most conservative group is the atheists. 63% of Eastern European atheists believe their countries should take no refugees from the Islamic world, whereas only 54% of Christians believe the same thing. So yeah, the Intermarium should be a loose confederation, most of the time on things outside trade, external borders, especially the border with Russia, and foreign policy, but I believe unions that have at least some level of cultural compatibility that goes beyond the current generations is a union that is far more likely to last than rather artificial constructs like the European Union, which purport to assert that the average Finn is the same with the average Sicilian because they both use the euro currency. It just doesn't work that way. Now, as to how the Intermarium should be built, I think we're on the right path already, by and large. The Intermarium should not be rushed in or forced, but rather allowed to develop slowly, at the market pace, if you want, and it should be thought, especially in its early years, as a complementary structure to NATO. Some Intermarium advocates say that it should also act as a complementary structure to the European Union, but I think that is wrong. First, it would repeat the mistake of the Visegrad Triangle, later on the V4, by engaging in the same type of naivete that Western Europe is reliable. Probably 5 years ago I would have agreed somewhat with such a view, but things have happened in the meantime, and when new evidence emerges, I would rather change my position instead of claiming that reality must be wrong, as the Europhile progressives tend to do when inconvenient facts are brought in. One such fact is that the new president of France wants to push for sanctions against Poland and Hungary for their refusal to welcome with open arms the vibrant diversity and progress that made northern Paris an Islamic no-go zone. With such friends, who the hell needs enemies? Same goes with Germany. which pretty much ignored Polish, Finnish and Swedish security concerns over the Nord Stream pipeline, which is now used, just like the security experts in Sweden and Poland predicted, as an excuse to have Russian Navy in the Swedish and Polish territorial waters for the purposes of espionage. And this not to mention that the whole deal was basically a cronyist deal where Gerhard Schröder used his friends in the former Stasi to get in touch with Putin, who is again a former KGB officer, and after stepping down as Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder led the shareholders committee of the notoriously secretive company Nord Stream AG, incorporated in Switzerland, that built the pipelines. Yet Germany is now lecturing Poland or Romania or Hungary on corruption? Really? None of the Intermarium countries have done such dirty deals over the heads of their neighbors. Not to mention, Germany is pissed off that Poland won't cooperate on the mass immigration front, even as Germany crapped and has been crapping on Poland and Polish interests for the last 12 years at the very least. And I could go on like this for another hour. There are similar horror stories concerning Hungary and Slovakia that I know of, and I'm pretty sure there are even more than that, and many other stories that I don't know because of the language barrier. And it is for these reasons that I don't believe the Intermarium could or indeed should view itself as a complementary structure to the European Union. Now, I'm not saying that the Intermarium should be outright hostile to the European Union, but I am saying that Poland has it right. Severe prejudice and skepticism on everything Russian and on everything European Union. One last thing that I should say is that I am skeptical of both the defeatist attitudes of, oh no, it cannot be done, the Poles hate Romanians, the Romanians hate the Huns, blah 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 blah, but I'm also quite skeptical of the highly optimistic views by some of the Polish and Ukrainian fans of the Intermarium project. Those with a very defeatist attitude make the mistake of believing that such projects are built based on the opinions of some schmuck on the street or some random troll in YouTube comment sections. They are not. The public's opinion overall will of course influence the process, but not to the extent that the defeatists imagine. By the same token, the very optimistic ones have a far too open mind. I mean, it is cute to think that the Intermarium could include Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and mind you, I wish it could, especially Armenia, which I'm looking forward to visit this summer. By the way, please do give a shekel for that endeavor. Anyway, I wish it could include especially Armenia, but just because you and I wish something, that does not make it achievable. Now, I am open to persuasion on this topic, and I will make sure to ask around about Intermarium when I'll be in Georgia and Armenia this summer. But when all is said and done, even a very strong Intermarium would still have severe difficulties in defending Georgia in particular. It's just pure geographical reality. Even under a best-case scenario, assuming everything works well in our favor and we build a big, strong Intermarium, we, and by we I mean the core of the Intermarium, still cannot hope to rush in to defend Georgia in due time. But again, I am open to persuasion on this point. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, heck, maybe I'm wrong about the whole thing and Intermarium will never be possible. But then, though again, the developments in the last 7 or 8 years give sufficient grounds for, let's call it, cautious optimism. As far as I'm concerned, some form of Intermarium will have to emerge sooner or later, and it will because these are stubborn nations that won't go down so easily. And Intermarium is not only much more peaceful, but also far more advantageous from a civilizational standpoint. I'm not saying it is perfect, it clearly isn't, because nothing is perfect, but I am saying it is something to consider. So, what do you all think? Is a Eastern European Union needed? And if not, why not? And if yes, what configuration should it take? And why? Let's discuss this for a while, because whether you like it or not, it's an idea that will roll for quite some time now, and it will get louder. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support, without which none of these would have been possible. And I guess I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.